Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary. Well, I've been in a cloning type of mood recently, and yet another title intrigued me enough to want to try remaking it in Game Maker. That game, of course, is the simple yet very addictive Vampire Survivors. So the basics were up first. This included creating an enemy that constantly moves towards the player, and a projectile to defeat said enemy. And yes, we're starting with the magic bolt before the whip. Anyway, the setup is similar to previous projects we've done in the past, hurt system and all. Defeated enemies would drop experience in the form of an object, which could be collected by the player to, well, fill their experience meter. A tick function which would run every step was then created to both spawn enemies and control the player's attacks. These events were decided via Game Maker's in-game timer and some math. A quick stress test showed that Game Maker is actually capable of quite a few more objects on screen than I anticipated, though I assume late game in Vampire Survivors gets far crazier. For the time being, we should be able to have a similar amount of chaos going on in our version. So an attack function was added, which for now would only contain code for the magic projectile. Again, typical projectile creation code here, nothing that we haven't done before, which generally speaking should have made this a walk in the park. Unfortunately, this project was set up almost a month before recording, and so because Vampire Survivor includes a lot of things on screen, several object pools and stacks were used to recycle enemies, projectiles, and experience pickups, instead of constantly creating new ones. And so after realizing that was the case, all the creation code was then rewritten to use the pooling system. And to add to the mess, to avoid even more confusion, enums were introduced. After a great deal of rewrites, the basics were completed. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start and one that actually worked as needed. So next came the challenging part of how to handle Vampire Survivors' weapons. Eventually, I settled on using a global array of data arrays, which, to make things as coherent as possible, would also use enums. A DS list stored in our controller object would then keep track of the weapons players pick up, which again for now is just the magic bolts. The attack code was then updated to pull projectile data from this list, which would pull data from the arrays stored in the global arrays. Convoluted? Maybe, but it worked as our system now functioned based on that global data. So next up was the addition of the whip weapon. This weapon would require a new state variable for the whip, and that state would be used to, well, determine the state of the player's whip attack. The whip state would only be active for about a fourth of the attack's cooldown time, during which a collision rectangle the size of the whip sprite would be created. A list variant would be used to keep track of any and all enemies caught within that rectangle. Those enemies would then have their hurt systems activated. Then the whip swipe effect was added to the draw code to appear only when the whip is active. And the results were pretty dang similar to the whip featured in Vampire Survivors, albeit a bit shorter. So while we may have had a rough start, and believe me, the amount of time spent on the first half was embarrassing, still we managed to end the session on a high note with 2 weapons added. And there's so much I wasn't able to get to this session, but generally speaking, I'll be working on this project at a random pace. Mostly because I'm still early on in Vampire Survivors and haven't unlocked much. However, as I see more, this project will continue as I try to learn what makes this simple concept so dang addictive. But for now, that'll do it for this episode of Dev Diary. So if you enjoyed today's entry, consider leaving a like. Be sure to also subscribe and hit that bell if you haven't already, and let me know if you've played Vampire Survivors for yourself. And regardless, what do you think of the game? Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.